Conference, Speaking to Power, Feminist Theories and Praxes. We've had 2 exciting days of talks and keynotes, and today we're going to have another. So to start off, we're going to have the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. So to begin the day, I'm gonna pass on the mic, so to say, to Ferdy, who will be chairing the keynote session. So off to you, Ferdy. You are on mute.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning to everyone. In the global crisis of the present, women, queer, and trans persons have suffered systemic abuse and intersectional oppressions. Their death, mostly unresolved and ignored, are staggering pieces of evidence in which brown, Black, queer, and Indigenous bodies are devalued and rendered invisible in societies where they are considered not human enough and not grievable at all. In the wake of this pandemic, BIPOC have been consistently exposed to domestic abuse and state violence. If death and aggression were or are essential parts of the pre and during pandemic precarious normality, Jackie Alexander admonishes us not to go back to that normal. To talk about genealogies of violence as feminist praxis is Professor Setsu Shigematsu of the University of California, Riverside. Professor Shigematsu is a Canadian scholar based in the United States. She finished her undergraduate degree at McGill and completed her MA and PhD at Cornell University with training across the fields of Asian, Japan studies, Asian American studies, feminist and gender studies. Her intellectual and scholarly concerns include the historical relationship between the United States and Japan imperialisms, transnational liberation movements, comparative feminist and critical theory, and media and cultural studies. Dr. Shigematsu's monograph Scream from the Shadows, the Women's Liberation Movement in Japan, offers the first sustained analysis of the radical feminist movement that emerged in 1970 with its lessons for contemporary politics. She's the co-editor with Keith Camacho of Militarized Currents Towards a Decolonized Future in Asia and the Pacific, which examines the militarization of Asia and the Pacific as extension of US and Japan colonialism in the region with a focus on gender and indigenous resistance. Professor Shigematsu is the director, writer, and co-producer of Visions of Abolition, a new feature-length documentary about the prison industrial complex and the prison abolition movement. The film documents the rise of the prison industrial complex in the United States in relation to the history of slavery, capitalism, and the war on drugs. Visions of Abolition focuses on the women's experience in the prison system and their activism in the prison abolition movement, providing a critical expose of the radical and gender violence perpetrated in the prison system. Friends, let us welcome Professor Setsu Shigematsu.
Thank you so much, Ferdy, and thank you all of you for inviting me here today. I would like to just begin by stating that it's an honor to share this space with you, and I'm really looking forward to this dialogue together. I would like to share my screen, so I think just the host has to allow me to do that, and then we can get started. Let's see. Great. Okay. Are you able now to see my PowerPoint? You can?
Yeah, yeah.
It looks okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm doing something a little bit awkward. I'm showing my PowerPoint on on the screen here, and then I'm just gonna be reading from my second laptop down here below. So please bear with me if it's slightly awkward. I guess we're all getting used to this new situation. So thank you again, Ferdy and Binta, and to all the organizers for all the labor that goes into organizing a conference in this new way. I know that this kind of labor often goes unaccounted for and unseen. As Ferdy began with the opening comments, to note, we are definitely living in a time of unprecedented political possibility and unprecedented global threat, environmental and ecosystem catastrophes, a pandemic that disproportionately impacts communities of color, combined with openly encouraged white supremacist, neo-fascist violence, a triple threat against species coexistence and survival. To this end, I come to you all with a sense of solidarity and desire to think and dialogue with you and propose that we embrace this unprecedented challenge and its political possibilities, not as just individuals, but as an invitation to urgently invent new forms of collectivity and together refuse the neoliberal constraints that have become so normalized in spaces such as the academy, in which value is supposedly measured by what one individual produces in a textual format, as opposed to creatively, right, and collectively forging praxes that will effectively put an end to the cannibalizing, destructive machines of racial capitalism and these settler colonial states that we live in. So in my presentation today, I bring to this conversation three distinct feminist analytics and epistemologies that are grounded in three projects that I've had the racial, class, and gendered privilege to work on. The first is an alternative epistemology of violence and feminism that I learned from while researching and from the activists who were the living bodies of knowledge who formed my first book, Scream from the Shadows, of the women's liberation movement in Japan. And second, I've learned the importance of centering Indigenous ways of life and knowledge, and to be mindful of the trajectories and pitfalls of decolonization that I've learned through the project of Militarized Currents towards a decolonial future in Asia and the Pacific. As part of the project was trying to connect sites and strategies of resistance against the global violence of the US military industrial complex. And finally, last but definitely not least, rather I argue this is the most formative epistemology in my current work, which is the Black feminist abolitionist tradition. And this learning and praxis was grounded in my work at a reentry home for women coming home from prison and women on probation and parole from 2005 to 2013 in South Los Angeles, where I served as a volunteer educator with the Critical Resistance chapter in Los Angeles and taught self-defense workshops for the women residents there. So this work became the basis of my documentary Visions of Abolition, From Critical Resistance to a New Way of Life. And I'm currently working on an updated version of this film. And throughout the next year and a half, I look forward to making three new films on police abolition, one on another episode on abolitionist migrant defense work against detention and deportation, and queer and trans abolitionist organizing with trans theorist and filmmaker Eric Stanley and my departmental colleague Latipa X, a decolonial filmmaker. In today's talk, I bring to bear the antagonisms of three genealogies of feminist violence as praxis. First being carceral feminism and how it compares to Japanese radical feminism and contrasts with the Black feminist abolition. So these are the three genealogies I'm proposing to discuss with you today. My title, Genealogies of Violence as Feminist Praxis, was intended to be a provocation, a provocation to thinking, imagining, and catalyzing a dialogue beyond the normalized discourses of the academy and many contemporary social and feminist movements. That said, this subtitle that I've added signals to one of the objectives of my presentation today, which is to recast and reframe how we articulate genealogies of feminism, because arguably feminisms have been predominantly understood as fundamentally anti-violence movements or formations. Through this presentation, I lay out an alternative understanding of feminism's historical relationship with violence, its constitutiveness in structural violence, and re-articulate three distinct ideologies of violence as feminist praxis. So I'll begin with carceral feminism and then take a detour en route to abolition feminism through anti-imperialist Japanese women's lib of the early 1970s. My point in revisiting the radical feminist movement in Japan will demonstrate how being anti-patriarchal or anti-capitalist or being anti-imperialist is not enough. In this examination of Japanese feminism, it then allows us to move to what I describe as the unexamined roots of abolition feminism, as the third and final destination of this lecture, as the most, and I think as the most important destination for this moment. And I want to emphasize that in this third part, what I want to delve into is what I am describing as a queer feminist ethics of violence as part of these unexamined roots of abolition feminism. So not only today will I be emphasizing the distinction between abolition feminism against carceral feminism, but rather in today's paradigm, what I'm calling for is an affirmative paradigm that involves this queer feminist ethics of violence as the underground roots of abolition feminism. Okay, so to move to my first point of departure, which is to address this genealogy of carceral feminism, which, as we know, is an outgrowth of white liberal feminism. The latter has not only arguably been the dominant form of feminism, canonized and taught through the 1980s and 90s, and in the academy, and popularized, of course, in the media, right? And we can think of, flicks like Kill Bill, which is, I think, part of this longer media legacy of liberal feminism. But more importantly, but more problematically, is this refusal to identify and demarcate these forms of feminism as white Euro-American, which evince their colonializing and universalizing tendencies. So I suggest that going forward, those of us who are doing queer, gender, and feminist studies, we really insist on problematizing the kind of dominant nomenclature that is called these the first and second wave, and actually, half joking, half seriously, they should better be renamed as something like the first white settler colonial hetero anti-black, wave, first and second waves, in terms of especially also their class positionality. And from this foundation and genealogy of settler colonialism and racial capitalism, systems that uphold property and individualism, the second wave feminists, organized a praxis that has been subsequently named carceral feminism. This name has been, credited to Elizabeth Bernstein in 2007, but we should also recall that this type of feminism was being called out by the movement Inside Women of Color Against Violence from 2000 onwards, so for the last 2 decades. And this refers, as we know, to the reliance on police, prisons, and the criminal legal system to address gender and sexual violence. And carceral feminism have not only turned to the state to address these issues of gender and sexual violence, but what they have done most problematically is help to fortify and legitimize the carceral state. And what I mean by the carceral state, I'm going to talk about in my next slide. But want to just underscore is this form of feminist praxis of violence, as we know, disproportionately impacts low-income communities of color, and we also know that this form of carceral feminists have prioritized, right, these kind of keywords of equality and justice and the legal and judicial system to push forth legislation such as in the United States, excuse my American reference, VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, which was passed in 1994 as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement bill. So in this name of anti-violence, these feminists have strengthened the racial gendered violence of the carceral state, which is much more normalized and that weaponizes the power of law, policing, and culture to immobilize and to repress, isolate people as a form of dehumanizing control passing as justice. So for more on carceral feminism, I just quickly refer you to the work of Mimi Kim, Beth Ritchie, Erica Miners, Andrea Ritchie, and many others who are doing work in this emergent field of critical cultural studies. But based on what I've been able to see from the program and many of your titles, you are doing cutting edge work in this area, which demonstrates the violent and contradictory impacts of the carceral state. So I'm just going to briefly offer a definition of the carceral state here. And this working definition of the carceral state is that which normalizes gendered anti-Black racial colonial violence by weaponizing law, culture, and policing to isolate, displace, and immobilize target people and communities. It utilizes criminalization not only through jails, prisons, and detention centers, but through the entire legal apparatus, determining what bodies, right, are illegal, what bodies are criminalized and non-normative. It is a logic of social order through technologies of dehumanization, human capture, and incapacitation under the sanctimonious guise of law and order. Now, this definition is precisely an example of the invention that I'm talking about, because rather than crediting it to any individual, I'm a member of a group of scholar activists, and we've been working on this document and resource list for many months, which will soon be published next month as From Critical Resistance. So this first point about carceral feminism is something that I just want us to pause and think about for a moment, because this genealogy that is rooted in white liberal feminism, which in turn is founded on white colonial modernity, is not only something that we need to think about in terms of problematizing also the ways in which this foundation of liberal feminism infects our work today as scholars in the academic industrial complex that operates as a pivotal institution upholding the colonial capitalist and carceral values. How does our own research, our own method of posing questions become inflected with colonial, carceral, liberal, and neoliberal values and methods? So the majority of today's presentation will then depart from this genealogy of carceral feminism and explore and examine what I see are the underground and underarticulated dimensions of abolition feminism and its relationship to hegemonic and counter-hegemonic violence. This confrontation with current forms of colonial violence, gendered, racialized, anti-Black, and anti-Indigenous state violence, and heteropatriarchal violence and political violence will allow us to distinguish between, these different kinds of violences that we need, I think, a more precise analytic to move forward. In doing so, I demonstrate what I am referring to as this queer feminist ethics and analytics of violence and a feminist philosophy of force. And I argue that this schema is something that we need to collectively grapple with, theorize, and critically embrace. And what I want to make clear is that the violence of carceral feminism, rooted in liberal feminism, is in turn grounded in colonial modernity produced through racial capitalism that generated, as we know, capital through the trade in captured African bodies turned into slave labor to uphold this thing called white civilization. And this visualization on this slide of the roots and routes of carceral feminism, we can, through it, we can immediately apprehend that carceral violence is hardly an aberration of white civilization, but rather another manifestation of the same logic of capturing and immobilizing bodies to produce this hierarchy of power that determines who is free to live with such abundance of promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice, as the Americans say, which are all modalities of white freedom based on Black social death, whose only freedom was at the time to choose death or enslavement as perpetual punishment. And later on in this presentation, I'm going to return to this important distinctive function of white freedom, because we as class privileged academics are continually being hailed and interpolated by its seductive call, a seduction of power that spurns and turns us away from a commitment to bring about the material conditions necessary for Black and Indigenous freedom. So my final point here in this first section, I have two more points. We must begin to expand beyond the confines of critiquing the impact of carceral feminism and settler colonial capitalist system and carceral state, and think about how these structures confine and domesticate our own work and projects. Its logics, authority, and hierarchies need to be not only criticized, but rejected, repudiated, and radically transformed, so that feminists of any color and gender seeking to assimilate and climb the corporate academic ladder will not think that we can somehow reform the white power, the violence of white power, in order to render it slightly more diverse, inclusive, and less lethal. On this next slide, sorry, I forgot to advance it, was an image from ABC News of prison cops with a woman in the mix, having all jumped on this Black male inmate, John Neville, who we can't see, but could be heard saying, "I can't breathe," before he died. So we know in 2020, right, that this legacy of white liberal feminism has for centuries sought heteronormative political and economic equality with the heteropatriarchal cisgendered man who represents, as Sylvia Winter has taught us, the colonial being. So along with this trajectory and genealogy, which must be clearly and loudly rejected, none of us are aspiring to be the next Margaret Thatcher, Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, or Amy Coney Barrett, or RBG. And I raise this series of powerful women who have achieved this equality and risen to stand alongside cis white male colonial beings to point out just how dangerous and seductive this genealogy of white feminism has been, given its support of a system of settler colonialism founded on racial capital. So to move on now to the next and I think more interesting parts of this presentation, I would like to demonstrate now the breadth of the genealogy of abolition feminism. This genealogy is guided by and for Black freedom, traverses centuries, continents, and multiple temporalities, and can be traced to myriad sites. But given our limits of time today in my own area of knowledge, I'm going to focus on a particular Japanese Black problematic relationality in order to discuss the following. I'm going to demonstrate how the work of Angela Davis, who has arguably served as the leading advocate of abolition feminism for the last half century, has impacted other genealogies of feminism around the world. The radical Japanese women's lib movement demonstrated moments and stances that I have described in my work as proto-abolition feminism in terms of the activist critical rejection of the dominant logics of the imperial carceral capitalist state and gendered violence. And I also raise this example to demonstrate that even our current notions of intersectionality are not going far enough to advocate the dismantling of the state and its carceral logics. So in the remainder of my talk with you today, I'm going to talk a bit about the 1970s Japanese women's liberation movement and touch upon what I'm calling this proto-abolitionist feminism and their use of counter-hegemonic violence as a feminist praxis, which was even inspired by the abolitionist guidance of Angela Davis. And by delving into these stances, I demonstrate how we must be also critical of anti-Black appropriations of Black liberation and how there is a need to develop and articulate what I'm describing as a queer feminist ethics of violence to guide us in our assessment and our analysis of counter-hegemonic violence. This journey that traces the roots and routes of feminist abolition will demonstrate this need for what I'm calling a feminist philosophy of force that has been, I think, under-articulated due to the policing discourse that is normalized in the academy and even all of these tech companies. I'm wondering if some of you have heard about the fact that Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube all recently shut down an event that I was participating in that was going to have a dialogue with Leila Khalid at San Francisco State University. So literally 22 minutes before she had a chance to speak, even YouTube cut it off, and Zoom and Facebook would not allow its live streaming. So this is the type of censorship that is currently happening in terms of even these realms of academic feminism. So this feminist ethics of violence that I will be talking about will distinguish between different forms of structural and systemic violence to that of group-based and interpersonal and what I'm calling interpositional violences as an alternative framework that will serve as a counterpoint, not counterpunch to the dominant forms of violence that police our minds and our imaginations, as to use a phrasing that organizer Paula Rojas has shared recently with me. And that we have to then in these ways also get the carceral state out of our own minds and imaginations. And given the fact that many of, I don't know if many of you are living in the United States, but they're here down in Southern California, we are facing, I think, a kind of unprecedented political moment where the occupant of the White House has been bragging about the possibility of not peacefully allowing any kind of transition after the election. So all the more so, I think we need guidance on what forms of violence for self-defense might be ethical in a time of danger when the vestiges and advocates of white supremacy are being challenged in an unprecedented way as part of our transcontinental protests for Black life. So I think that I'm hoping that this dialogue that I'm bringing to you today I think is very relevant to this political moment that we are in today. So next, I'm just going to briefly touch on what I'm calling these proto-feminist abolition stances within the Japanese women's lib movement. But I call them proto because they were not fully abolitionists, because these activists were not fighting for the abolishment of the carceral system as necessary for all women's liberation. Nonetheless, they engaged in what I would call, right, these proto-abolitionist feminist strategies insofar as the activists of the movement organized around mothers who killed their children. They organized also on behalf of Nagata Hiroko, who was a revolutionary leader of, this is an image of Nagata Hiroko, of the United Red Army, which was a revolutionary group which had engaged in the unethical violence of purging and killing 14 of their own comrades. And this became exposed and became a downfall of the post-war Japanese New Left radical movement. And the third point that I want to talk about and focus on for the kind of heart of today's lecture is a passage in a book by Tanaka Mitsu, who was the leading activist and theorist of the Japanese women's lib movement. And in this book called Inochi no Onna Tachi e, which could be translated as something like Towards a Living Womanhood or To My Soul Sisters, she talks about an incident in which she fights back against her father's abuse. Tanaka Mitsu was both a survivor of child sexual abuse and domestic violence, as well as her mother. And she talks about this time where rather than continuing in this cycle, right, of family violence, she fought back against her father, who would regularly beat her and her mother. And once she physically fought back against her father, he stopped, this cycle stopped in the face of her direct challenge. So Tanaka's experience using counter-hegemonic violence liberated her and her mother from her father's heteropatriarchal harm, and her physical resistance protected and validated her existence. And she presents this form of counter-hegemonic violence as preventing a future of harm, specifically in this context of family violence. And in reflecting on this, she makes this statement stating, what I don't have, but what I want to possess is violence. In Japanese, it's boryokusei. And in this passage, she goes on to say, perhaps my very existence is violent, but within me, what is lacking is the concrete expression that one can understand, such as the raised fist. And as we know at this time in history, in the early 1970s, the raised fist most famously signified Black power as a symbol of solidarity and potential internationalism. We know that the raised fist, of course, signals a kind of anti-authoritarian militancy and fighting back, which was also at the center of the sign of feminism. Now, as she goes on to analyze this kind of cycle of family violence, heteropatriarchal violence in family, she goes on to say, the cause of my father's violence was a response to women who rebel. It was the whip that the overseer or slave breaker uses against the slave. And then she goes on to quote Angela Davis, the master is always on the verge of becoming the slave, and the slave possesses the real concrete power to make him always on the verge of becoming a master. And this quote is what is going to lead us to the second part of this discussion that I call Angela Davis and the Black Freedom Bridge to Abolition. Now, in 1972, when Tanaka was actually writing this book, and it was also published in 1972, when we think about, right, how is it that Tanaka Mitsu is citing Angela Davis, who at this time was literally in a cage in the United States in California? And in February of 1972, Angela Davis had just been released from her 16-month incarceration after being hunted down by the police. And as a Black woman on the FBI's most wanted list, she was a resistance fighter in the afterlife of slavery, fleeing from the police who were formed through the modernization of slave patrols. President Nixon congratulated the FBI on their capture of this high-profile fugitive, calling Davis, right, a dangerous terrorist. Now, when I read Tanaka's quote way back in the day when I was in graduate school doing my research, I was really wondering how on earth was she quoting Angela Davis in 1972. And recently I found the source of this, which was this work that was published by the Committee to Free Angela Davis. It was published in 1971. And what they published was her 1969 lecture that she gave at Royce Hall to a standing room only audience in 1969. 1969 when she was called back after Ronald Reagan had fired her for being a communist. And so this kind of policing of discourse that goes on in the academy is, I think, constant and has been very internalized by those of us who kind of know the language of what, what is that fine line of what we can say or cannot say in terms of preventing us from being fired. And in Angela Davis' case, even though she was brought back after being fired for being communist, she was fired again for her quote unquote inflammatory language. So this quote that I just recently read on the last slide about the master-slave relationship, and Tanaka quoting it to make sense of her situation of family violence with her family, was from this lecture that Angela Davis gave at Royce Hall. And I want to spend the next few minutes delving into what I think are some of its most important points that remain relevant even 50 years later. In the above passage that I read, where Tanaka was quoting Angela Davis, she was repeating it and following what so many non-Black liberation movements and non-Black feminists were doing in the late 60s and early 70s, that is taking their lead from Black liberationists. While acknowledging that Black liberation movements indeed led and guided the path to freedom for many non-Black movements in the US and around the world, we must at the same time acknowledge the incommensurability of the master-slave relation to that of other systems of organized violence. Tanaka's appropriation of the master-slave relationship to make sense of her father's violence towards her mother attempts to draw this direct analogy between that of her father to that of the slave master to the slave. Even though this appropriating Black oppression is deeply problematic, this is a very common analogizing practice that is all too common and pervasive and entirely objectionable as a symptom of anti-Blackness, as João Costa Vargas has argued in The Denial of Anti-Blackness, Multiracial Redemption and Black Suffering. This anti-Black appropriation of Blackness has become a general practice of multiracial POC movements and feminist movements for over half a century. And because of this kind of, I think, appropriation, that is why now we're using, right, the term BIPOC instead of just POC. The above Japanese to Black passage that connects Tanaka to Davis, that compares the Japanese daughter physically fighting back to that of a slave, points precisely to the need of a feminist ethics of violence that distinguishes between different contexts of oppression and dominance. So just to now move to this issue then of these different types of liberation movements that were emerging in the 60s and 70s, I want to also then critique the fact that Tanaka's liberation praxis, for all of its radicalism, remained limited to her own hetero-ethnocentric liberation. And thus this raises a question of liberation in relation to the other, and in this political conjuncture of 2020, which remains at the heart of this inquiry. So before we move on to this discussion of a feminist ethics of violence, I'm going to just take one last quick detour to Frantz Fanon via Jean-Paul Sartre, beginning with Davis's engagement with this French philosopher. And now in her lecture that Angela Davis was giving, she opens, in the opening part of her lecture, she takes to task this French existentialist, because as we also may recall, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote it forward to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and when we think about it, it's directly preceding that first famous chapter concerning violence. And so the beginning of Davis's lecture, she takes to task what she calls one of the most notorious statements of this French existentialist, which is here, even the man in chains remains free, and for this reason, he is always at liberty to eliminate his condition of slavery, even if that means his death. What Davis goes on to make clear is that, like so many other European male philosophers, Sartre failed to distinguish the relationship between white freedom and Black freedom. So this point is what Davis would emphasize as she went on in her lecture to talk about how white freedom, the master's freedom, is at the expense of the freedom of the other. And I would like to just quote here from Davis's lecture, and I'll say that in this slide here, I have deliberately inserted the words Black freedom and Black physical resistance, because although Davis did not say these words in her lecture, I would argue that she would not be allowed to have said them, because again, then they would be, then this entire lecture would be could be considered too inflammatory. But I will read this passage now, and you will get what I mean as I go on in my comments. The first condition of Black freedom is the first is the open act of resistance, Black physical resistance, violent resistance. In this act of resistance, the rudiments of freedom are already present, and the violent retaliation signifies much more than the physical act. It is a refusal to not only submit to the flogging, but the refusal to accept the definitions of the slave master. In the slide, right, I've added these words Black freedom and Black resistance to underscore the importance of the historical structural racial distinction. So Davis goes on in her lecture, and she does not openly advocate the death of the master, but here in her lecture, she describes in detail Frederick Douglass's physical revolt against his master, grabbing him by the throat, right? Until the master is no longer the master. And it is not insignificant that alongside Hegel's phenomenology of the mind, philosophy of right, Davis invokes Nat Turner no less than 4 times. So she continues her lecture distinguishing between the philosophical foundations and conditions of white freedom versus Black liberation and Black freedom. Davis's feminist, anti-slavery, anti-colonial pro-use of force thus forthrightly affirms an ontology of violence and violent resistance as inexorable. In a system of white colonial freedom predicated on anti-Blackness, the question we face in 2020 is, what are we going to do in the face of the lethality of white freedom, which systematically and materially is at the expense of Black and Indigenous lives? So it is instructive here to compare Davis with Fanon, as we know he is the foremost proponent and theorist of anti-colonial violence of the 20th century. Fanon is famously known for describing the subjectivizing power of anti-colonial violence, stating that violence is man recreating himself. Quoting, violence is a cleansing force. It frees the native from his inferiority complex, from his despair and inaction. That was a quote from Wretched of the Earth. And so I regularly teach Fanon, and we've been offered profound lessons, especially through his analysis of the desire of the colonized man and the colonized woman, and connected to his affirmation of the subjectivizing force of anti-colonial violence to rise up and defeat the colonizer. We cannot underestimate his analysis of the trajectory of the colonized man's desire to be, to take the place of the white man, for him to take his wife and occupy his bed and enjoin himself with a white woman. Because as we know, Fanon went on to marry a white woman, but we all also know that being with a white woman does not liberate the man of color or his people from the trap of colonial desire or make the man of color white, and neither does being with the white man make the woman of color white either. Abolition feminism, though, in contrast, right, I think very clearly repudiates the existing trajectories of liberation that are defined in terms of either equality with the white male, with white male power, or taking his place in opposition to white carceral and white liberal feminism mentioned at the outset of this lecture. Davis asserts that Black freedom not only requires physical violent resistance, but crucially the rejection of the master's terms, which would include the philosophical and foundations that structure our very notion of being, freedom, and power. Winter in her, Sylvia Winter in her essay, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, Freedom After Man and Its Overrepresentation, exposes this chain of signification and how man, modernity, and Western and his Western bourgeois concept of the human has overrepresented himself as the conception, as though it is this man who defines the human in modernity, and it is this man who is, as we know, entitled to sovereignty and freedom and rights within the nation state, organizing the world according to his truth. And it is these coordinates of modernity's architecture and man's embodiment of colonial being and his notions of power and freedom that we must do more than just unsettle through our critiques. In order to actually dismantle the system, I'm talking about the praxis of actually dismantling it, we face violent resistance to such changes as is manifest in the protests for Black lives today. If we can think about, right, the toppling of all the colonial statutes and what that represents both symbolically and in terms of these violent confrontations that are ongoing. And hence we need all the more so this ethics of violence to guide us through these dangerous times. Okay, thank you for bearing with me. I'm on the last and final part of my lecture. And this part 3 is what I'm calling a queer feminist ethics of violence. And this is a response to a long-standing understanding and binary representation of feminism as being fundamentally anti-violence, and thereby conceding the terms and definition of power of violence itself to existing hegemonic determinations. This is an aspect of what I believe we need to develop together collectively as a philosophical and analytical system of transformative violence. And in this last section, I want to say that there's going to be a kind of like a social sciencey looking diagram, which I don't tend to do a lot of, but I talk about this need for an analytics of violence in 2 of my courses, one being Decolonizing the Screen and the other Gender Violence. And I begin both of those courses asking my students to consider and respond to the following question. And the question is, okay, is the violence of the rapist perpetrator the same as the violence of the survivor victim who fights back to prevent their harm and rape? And most of the time, most students will say, no, that's not the same type of violence. But to extrapolate then from this kind of imaginative experiment, I go on to ask that in what instance would you use violence and consider it ethical, and on behalf of whom? And so in these kind of cases, it's very easy to come up with the word, oh, self-defense. And for my loved ones. But the problem is that in our current legal system, it does not function with this kind of neutrality or objectivity, because as I'll go on to show in this schema, what I'm proposing is that when we have a better analytics of violence, we know that individuals are never just judged right under the law as kind of objective beings. So the following schema represents the early stages of what I'm proposing as the collective work that we can do together in building an alternative framework to approaching questions and conditions of violence in their structural and systemic and symbolic, group-based, interpersonal and interpositional forms. And this is the type of work I would advocate that we need to do together to build a system of transformative justice versus the current criminal legal system that we currently live under. This slide here outlines some of the components that factor into this ethics of violence. And as this chart indicates, this ethics of violence is built on and requires, on the one hand, on the left-hand side, the feminist analytics of violence, and on the right hand, what I'm calling this feminist philosophy of force. And then I'll briefly touch on how this analytic also gets us out of some of the more problems that need to be avoided, such as moral equivalence, false equivalences, moral relativism, and absolutism. And I'm proposing that this schema can help guide us through these very precarious times. So within this schema, I would say as well that we need to develop this, because even as abolitionist organizer and my friend and colleague Melissa Birch says, even in an abolitionist society, people will continue to engage in harmful behavior. As feminist abolitionists and from a queer epistemology, how are we to deal with the materiality and effects of anti-colonial and political violence and the use of force and harm for self-defense when it is necessary? So I want to begin just briefly touching upon this side, the right-hand side of the screen where it says feminist philosophy of force, and give you some examples of what I would consider these principles. And that would constitute this queer feminist philosophy of force. And my cat is trying to gain some freedom, so sorry, excuse me, I'm going to let her out. Okay, sorry for the feline interruption. So some examples of these principles would be, for example, minimal use of force to de-escalate and prevent lasting harm, as opposed to, as we see all the time, especially in the United States, right? Cops are like completely unloading their clips on Black and brown bodies. And that the threat or use of force is to prevent future harm, that we would have systematic actions to protect life, and not just the life of human beings, but all living beings, and that self-determination must be engaged in without causing harm to other living beings. And then finally, we need to, I think, center the principle of fairness and not equality so much, because equality has been problematic, as I think the first part of the lecture has shown, and collectively develop systems of restorative and transformative justice versus the kind of individualism that the current criminal justice system is founded upon. And so in what I'm calling this feminist analytics of violence, what I would argue is that first we need to have an understanding of systemic and structural violence. And we all have been doing this for decades upon decades, right, in this kind of academic scholarly work, because we can speak of these systems of chattel slavery with precision and detail: capitalist imperialism, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, trans and homophobia. And so we understand how these structural and systemic systems work. And then we understand as well through, the work of those like Chandra Mohanty and others, right, positionality. And then obviously so many people have theorized group-based power being, right, these typical coordinates that we can list off: nation, race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, religion, culture, and the ways in which these all intertwine to produce certain types of positionality as well as group-based power. So just to talk about the schema a little bit more, I do say that we do, I think, need the schema, because even on the left and among progressives and among radicals, we are, I think, oftentimes either arguing about or avoiding the actual question of political violence and what is our position on, right, the use of political violence and the ways in which the hegemonic kind of discourses have basically been able to, post the war on terror, name all kinds of resistance as like terrorist. And this even goes back to the naming of Angela Davis as a terrorist threat in early 1970s. But the problems that we could avoid by developing the schema is the idea of problems such as false equivalences, moral relativism, or absolutism. All violence is bad. I've heard actually many people and many pacifist identified people who do take the stance with this kind of universalizing tendency: there has always been war in history and we will never get out of war, which leads to this kind of, right, political apathy. But then what I'm advocating is that in the face of all of these forms of systemic violence, we can also then think about how we are actually theorizing this queer feminist ethics of violence by recalling these instances, right, of these forms of physical resistance by those like Harriet Tubman. Kanako Suga was an anarchist who was plotting to kill the Japanese emperor. Leila Khalid, who I referenced earlier, Cyntoia Brown, and C.C. McDonald. Because in all of these cases, what we have is examples of gender nonconforming bodies fighting back, not just against male-based violence, but entire systems of racialized gendered violence. And these are examples of counter-hegemonic violence, not only for personal self-defense, as in the cases of Cyntoia Brown or C.C. McDonald, but we must read these as interpositional convergences that are structured and sedimented in these interlocking systems of dominant power that must be analyzed through these principles of philosophy of force. And looking back on this century of abolitionist struggle, when we think of these gender nonconforming persons fighting for their freedom and breaking the chains, not only of the system of chattel slavery, but to this day, the chains of signification that attempted to define who lives and who dies, who is free and unfree, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and so forth. Extant paradigms and approaches to violence and conflict, including what is presumptively called the law and order, crime and justice, civil and human rights, and even international law have failed. Now I'm moving to my conclusion, so thank you for bearing with me. I think I'm just about at time too. So this is my final visual image. In this post-George Floyd, Breonna Taylor uprising world, too many are calling for equality before the law and the jailing of killer cops. But seriously, as if that could solve our problem. Abolition feminism is not calling for equality before the law. Rather, it seeks to expose the entire criminal legal system itself as an apparatus of injustice that needs to be exposed and repudiated in its entirety so that we will begin again and build a system of accountability and reparations from a completely different foundation and premise. Abolition feminism is a paradigm that involves an ethics of violence that builds on Davis's work over the past half century. At this conjuncture of 2020, I believe that we are at an unprecedented point of crisis where the use of political violence is taking on new forms. We must be ready to face questions of self-defense and the ethics of violence. And I hope that the provocation I forwarded this morning might provide a way of understanding feminism and feminist genealogies, not just as social political histories constituted outside or against all forms of violence, but against very specific systems and structures of violence that nonetheless need to account for their own forms of complicity and formation and non-anti-violence within larger historical structural systems of colonial modernity. Once we have a fundamentally different understanding of this constitution, then we can start having very different conversations about questions of complicity, contradiction, and the way forward. In closing, I would proffer to state that rather than looking out into the world blindfolded, structures and positionality of every person occupying determinate positions of power, once we realize there is no outside to these histories of violence, we might not be fearful in exploring every option available to stop the greater effects of violence, and that we have come to accept as inevitable. I close by quoting one of my favorite of Angela Davis's sayings that comes out of her autobiography: "Walls turned sideways are bridges." In other words, we might already have all the tools necessary to break down the walls that need to be broken down, and maybe it's just time to take off our blindfolds. Indeed, once we take off our blindfolds and start seeing our potential power differently, we can make our visions for abolition become a reality. Futurity will be ours to define, not given to those determined to monopolize and justify their histories and structures of violence. Although my perspective may not be an easy one to embrace, I appreciate this opportunity to share with you this audacious proposition that of what it might mean to fight for the freedom of others as though all of our lives depended on it. Thank you for listening to this work in progress, and I look forward to dialoguing with you.
Thank you, Setsu, for that rich and wonderful provocation, not to say audacious, challenge to us all regarding the use of violence as a way of resisting these powers that be. May I invite members of the audience to start
alert from Google Chrome
to start sharing their questions in the Q&A or chat box.
Alert from Google Chrome.
So this is a reaction from Ian. This is a fantastic lecture. I have two questions. Number one, how do we have a more, for the lack of a better term, comparative analysis of the temporal and spatial divides and understanding of liberal democracy and liberal feminism between the US and East Asia? And the second one is, it seems that in many contemporary East Asian contexts, desire is strong for feminist freedom within the tenet of liberal feminism. And the question is, I would like to know more about the Japanese context during which the feminists were writing, and perhaps the inter-East Asian and Southeast Asian traffics of radical imaginaries.
Thank you. I'm just going to grab a piece of paper for you.
Yeah.
On your questions. Thank you. So should I start with your questions, or do you want to, how do you want to, how have you been doing today?
Professor, there is another question, so perhaps you can answer these three questions one after the other. So this came from Yusra. So thank you, Professor Rodriguez, for such an informative presentation. May you expand more on what you mean by intersectionality not doing enough to abolish the carceral system? So that is from Yusra. And the two other questions from Ian.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Actually, if you don't mind, maybe I will go backwards and start with the question on intersectionality, and then trace back to the questions on liberal feminism and kind of Western, right, feminism versus Asian, East Asian. So I think that part of my, the crux of my provocation today is, okay, so all of us, in terms of our careers and our quote unquote bread and butter professions, right? We're knowledge producers, and our academic roles are to like critique and analyze, right? And obviously intersectionality is, and it has been an important concept within our modalities of analysis to move beyond these kind of like single access trajectories of, you know, talking about oppression as if it was just class or as if it was just gender, right? That many white paradigms have kind of forwarded as these major academic traditions of, let's say, Marxism or feminism without its proper demarcation as, let's say, white, European, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think that even in terms of having this kind of intersectional approach where we analyze the interlocking systems of oppression that determine the positionality of a particular body, I think that we actually go further than these kind of modes of understanding, analysis, and critique, and then turn our work to then producing what would be sustainable, maintainable, collective alternatives to these systems that are continually reproducing these forms of systemic and positional oppression. And so even though we've gotten to this point of understanding, now it's really, I think, just time to press against the systems in the form of being creative in terms of the knowledge production that we are doing, to say that from these, let's say, intersectional analyses, then where do we go from here to create these systems of transformative justice? And so that is what I think that my gesture towards intersectionality had to do with, is moving from, right, analysis and, let's say, theorization to the actual collective creation of these praxes that we need so desperately, I think. So I'm wondering if in the Q&A we're just doing kind of one respond or back and forth, but I'd be happy to do this back and forth in case I haven't adequately answered your questions. Going back to now, I think Ian's questions about liberal feminism, and I want to touch on, I think what Ian is rightly raising in terms of, you know, the relationship between something like the East and something like the West, or maybe you're not even talking about these geopolitical divides of what is called the West. I'm thinking about the ways in which, of course, I referred to colonial modernity, and the ways in which I think, you know, Western epistemologies, and the very fact that we're here speaking in English today through the kind of institutional schema of University of Toronto, a settler colonial society, the ways in which, right, these, like all of our diasporic bodies have been, in a sense, hailed, right, to do this kind of work from these positions of, you know, maybe not empire in the sense of US empire state, but I think, you know, kind of satellite to it. And so I think that we really have to continually think about and interrogate and challenge the ways in which I think those of us who are positioned outside of what is traditionally, I guess, understood as these Western frames, to what extent we continue to, I think, legitimize these larger structures of knowledge power formations as scholar activists, or to what extent our analysis and work and scholarship is really doing a kind of committed decolonizing rebuilding that I think we need to do very intentionally, as opposed to, I think, reproducing these existing dominant frames of reference, if that makes sense. And going to the second question, Ferdy, I might have to ask you to repeat it, because I think that it had to do again with you know, larger geopolitics, but I grabbed my pen and paper too late. So
okay.
Could you
Ian is asking, I would like to know more about the Japanese context,
right,
during which the feminists were writing, and perhaps the inter-East Asian and Southeast Asian traffics of radical imaginaries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's it. Thank you for that question. I might have to put on my headphones because I hear my house waking up, and the typical morning yelling is starting. I'm gonna put on my headphones so you don't have to hear anything too crazy. Okay, there we go. Japanese radical feminist movement in the 1970s, I think, had certain types of limitations in terms of being somewhat, I want to say, kind of self-centered and focused, as opposed to being much more, first and foremost, concerned with radical forms of solidarity.
Alert from Google Chrome.
Sorry, radical
Kathy
forms.
Griffin before and
I'm not sure how to turn off Google Chrome alerts. Been trying to figure that out for a while. Forms of solidarity, let's say, with Chinese workers in Japan, or Zainichi, Korean residents in Japan. Later, let's say, you know, in I think it was right the 80s and the 90s, definitely Filipina workers would come, and these radical feminists started to do solidarity work with them, but I feel like there was a bit of a time lag. In the 1970s radical context, the one, I think, form of solidarity that they attempted to engage in was, as Japan was becoming an economic power at the time, businessmen would go to Korea to
do these basically businessmen like sex tourism, and Japanese women were protesting the fact that Japanese men were engaging in this kind of what they would call like this new neo-imperialism that wasn't necessarily military invasion, but economic invasion combined with this kind of like, sexual commodification of Korean women. So that was one form where there was some kind of interaction as an attempt of solidarity towards Korean women, but it wasn't a sustained form of movement interactions between these different sites. So I actually think that even though there were these kind of radical moments where these activists would engage in direct action, they would literally go to the airport and be yelling at the businessmen, spray painting the windows and getting arrested for like spray painting the airport windows in Tokyo Airport. These were radical forms of direct action, but I still think that they didn't go far enough, because what we have to continually figure out is how do we build solidarity with anyone who would be like other to our own types of positionalities. And I think this is the difficult work of political and social movements that we all continue to struggle with to this day. And that's why even today I was highlighting the problems of, like, let's say Japanese Black relationality, or Asian Black relationality, or let's say Japanese to Korean, Chinese, Filipina, solidarities, because of these histories of colonialism and imperialism that we are all formed in. And so these are, I think, ongoing forms of struggle that I'm glad that you raised, but I feel like even 50 years later, as someone who studies radical social movements, these problems within social movements of basic solidarity and communication recycle over and over and over again. So it's quite, not to be pessimistic, but I think that many of us could probably attest to breakdowns in political formations that happen over very typical problems of, egotistical, bravado, or, personal hurt that never gets communicated adequately so that we can move on to a kind of potential healing or reparation and accountability. And that is, I'm afraid, these cycles that are continuing to this day.
Thank you, Setsu. This might be the last set of questions. So this came from the director of WGSI, Professor Elisa Trotz, and she wrote, "This was such an inspiring lecture full of inspiring provocations and so necessary now. Thank you." And the questions are, number one, I wondered if you might touch on Fanon's discussion of women in Algeria unveiled in the context of your analysis. And the second question is, thinking about carceral feminism, the complicated politics of institutionalization, and your incisive discussion of the law, how do we understand the self-defense and provocation of defense through the legal system for women and survivors of domestic violence through the legal system?
Thank you. Thank you, Elisa, for your great questions. I really enjoyed hearing your opening commentary yesterday, summarizing the 2 keynotes that I unfortunately had to miss due to my scheduling commitments. I'm hoping some of these sessions will be available for watching and listening to after the conference is over. So I'll be in conversation with the organizers about that. Regarding the first question of Fanon, wondering, Elisa, if there's something very specific you wanted to discuss, because I think that there's been so much feminist criticism of Fanon regarding women in Algeria, and the ways in which, some people say that his kind of analysis was too simplified and does not, again, bring up kind of the post-revolutionary problems that continued in terms of gender dynamics, and was not getting enough also at how difficult it was in revolutionary movements for women to be involved in ways that were, again, to use that, I think, problematic kind of Western framework of like having some kind of equal standing in these national third world liberation movements. So regarding, you know, this question, I would want to know, kind of as a follow-up to this dialogue, like what aspect of Fanon and his commentary on Algerian women you would be interested in discussing, because I know in terms of the literature there is just a lot out there, but I think that for me, what has always been a kind of contradiction in Fanonian studies, and I think about it as an entire subfield, is that I've talked to so many people who have been so deeply influenced by Fanon, and then we don't talk as much about Fanon's own choice of to marry and be with a white woman, even given the fact that he was such a, you know, important anti-colonial theorist, and what those forms of internalized contradiction and their manifestation mean for us who do scholarship around the work that always just privileges the written text over the lived embodied experience. And I think this kind of framing is a vestige of the ways in which white coloniality has privileged the written text, again, right, as our ultimate form of value, and how we estimate what people's accumulative scholarship is worth versus the kind of day-to-day embodied, like, lived praxis. And so I think that that's a very interesting question that remains for me vis-a-vis Fanon, even more than his writings on, like, Algerian women, if I could be so impolite as to raise the kind of elephant in the room of you know, when people of color choose to be with, let's say, white people as their partners. You know, I've also had a history in that category, so I'm not taking myself out of it, but I think that these are the kind of questions that I think remain very interesting and underarticulated. As for your great question about carceral feminism and the current legal stakes and problems, I think that there's so much interesting work that has been going on in this kind of abolitionist framework, projects like Survived and Punished, and so much current, like, anti-carceral feminist organizing around women and survivors who, as we know in the United States anyways, get, you know, let's say men get 2 to 6 years for killing their partners, and women get on average 15. So the kind of, right, gross discrepancies of this use of violence for self-defense in these gendered and kind of sexual intimate relationships, and the way in which the law comes down in these very uneven ways when women engage in these forms of self-defense, I think are pointing precisely to our need to completely abolish these current structures of legality, common law, etc., and begin anew. And these forms and necessary ways of beginning anew need to begin with us scholar activists, and, you know, creating these dialogues and bridges with many of the organizers on the ground who've been doing this work for decades. So I think that because for me, it's still early in the morning to think in the best, most clear way, since I'm a West Coast body. I apologize to all of you that I can really already tell for myself that my Q&A was caffeineless. I forgot to drink my coffee this morning too. So I'm sorry that I think that my my answers were a little fuzzy, and it's so strange too, talking into a screen of black squares. So I think that you know, for those of you who I did not especially do a good job answering your questions this morning, I feel, please feel free to reach out, email me, and love to continue this dialogue. And I'm authentically talking about this desire to do this collective work together of building this feminist ethics of violence. Because if I'm the only one talking about it, nothing's going to happen. So it has to be, right, this collective effort of us, like, building these cultural practices so that we can actually create a form of accountability and safety for each other that goes beyond just, like, you know, posturing. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shigematsu, for that very generative conversation this morning. And so at this point, we would like to move to our first panel presentation that is going to be chaired by Professor Karen Recollet on art activism. May I present to you Professor Karen Recollet.